Let me start with something that is incredibly important to understand, because if you miss this, you will spend months trying to decode behavior that was never designed to make sense to you. Why do avoidants send mixed signals? Because very often there is a conflict happening inside them. And that conflict is not necessarily between loving you and not loving you. It can be between two powerful psychological needs, the need for connection and the need for protection. Think about what happens when someone wants intimacy, but has learned, consciously or unconsciously, that intimacy comes with danger. The moment they begin getting emotionally close, one part of them says, this feels good, I want this person, I feel understood, I don't want to lose this. But another part says, be careful, you're getting too exposed, you're losing control, you're depending on someone. Now you've got an internal tug-of-war. And when there is an internal tug-of-war, external behavior becomes inconsistent. One day they may be deeply engaged with you. They may initiate conversations, show affection, ask personal questions, or make you feel like you're finally breaking through their walls. Then suddenly, something changes. They become quieter, they need space, their responses become shorter. Their energy shifts, and you're sitting there thinking, what happened? Yesterday, everything felt amazing. Here's what you need to understand. Emotional intensity can produce two opposite reactions at the same time. It can pull someone closer while simultaneously making them want to escape. That's the paradox. And this is where people make a critical mistake. They assume that inconsistency automatically means there are no feelings. Sometimes there are no feelings, of course. Sometimes someone is simply uninterested. But when you're dealing with an avoidant pattern, inconsistency can also emerge because closeness activates fears that the person has not learned to regulate. The tragedy is that the person on the other side usually experiences only the behavior, not the internal battle. You see the withdrawal. You don't see the fear behind it. You see the silence. You don't see the emotional overload. You see them coming back. You don't see the loneliness or longing that may have pulled them back. And because you cannot see their internal world, you naturally create your own explanation. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe they never cared. Maybe I should try harder. Maybe if I say the right thing, I can make them stay. But that's where you begin giving away your power. You start treating their emotional conflict as a problem you must solve. You become the investigator of their behavior instead of the architect of your own emotional life. And I want you to understand something deeper. Compassion does not require self-abandonment. You can recognize that someone is afraid of intimacy without accepting inconsistency as your permanent reality. You can understand their psychology without becoming trapped inside it. Because ultimately, the question isn't simply, what does this person feel? The more powerful question is, what are they capable of doing with what they feel? Their feelings matter, but mature relationships require more than feelings. They require communication, responsibility, consistency, and the courage to remain present when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. So don't become obsessed with decoding every signal. Understand the conflict, recognize the pattern, and then return your attention to yourself. Because their inner battle may explain their mixed signals, but it does not have to become your emotional prison. You don't need to decode someone else's confusion to become clear about your own worth. And once you understand that inner tug-of-war, you begin to see the next layer of the problem. Sometimes the avoidant isn't incapable of feeling deeply. They're incapable of comfortably translating those feelings into words. That's a very different thing. We often assume that if someone feels something strongly, they will naturally communicate it strongly. But human beings don't work that way. Emotional capacity and emotional communication are two different skills. A person can experience longing, attachment, fear, affection, jealousy, even grief, and still have almost no ability to sit down and say, this is what is happening inside me. Why? Because words create exposure. The moment you say, I miss you, you've revealed something. The moment you say, I'm afraid of losing you, you've surrendered some emotional armor. And for someone who has learned to protect themselves through distance, vulnerability can feel less like intimacy and more like risk. So instead of saying what they feel, they communicate indirectly. They may suddenly check on you. They may find an excuse to start a conversation. They may remember something insignificant you told them months ago. They may watch from a distance. They may become unusually attentive, then disappear again. They may return after creating distance, but still avoid the conversation that would explain why they came back. And this is where mixed signals become so powerful psychologically, because behavior is speaking, but language is silent. You receive enough evidence to believe something is there, but not enough clarity to know exactly what it means. And uncertainty creates obsession. The human mind hates unfinished emotional stories. When information is incomplete, we start filling the gaps. We analyze the message. We replay the conversation. We examine the timing. We wonder why they viewed something but didn't respond. We ask ourselves what their silence means. Suddenly, instead of living your life, you're interpreting theirs. And that's exhausting. But there's an important psychological distinction here. Understanding indirect communication does not mean romanticizing it. Just because someone may struggle to express their feelings doesn't mean you should endlessly tolerate ambiguity. Their inability to communicate may explain their behavior. It doesn't automatically make the behavior healthy. That's a distinction you need to carry with you, because otherwise you can become so fascinated by someone's hidden emotions that you start ignoring their visible actions. You tell yourself, they care deep down. Maybe they do, but they're just scared. Maybe they are. They don't know how to express themselves. That may be true, but then comes the question that changes everything. What are they willing to do about it? Because emotional maturity isn't the absence of fear. Emotional maturity is the ability to act responsibly while fear is present. A person doesn't have to become perfectly secure overnight. They don't have to communicate flawlessly. But there must eventually be movement toward honesty, accountability, and consistency. And the same principle applies to you. You don't have to become cold because someone else struggles with vulnerability. You don't have to chase them either. You can remain compassionate while maintaining standards. You can say, in effect, I understand that you may struggle to express what you feel, but I also need relationships where feelings can eventually be communicated clearly. That's strength, because the goal isn't to force someone to confess their emotions. The goal is to stop measuring your worth by whether they can express theirs. Remember this, hidden feelings may explain behavior, but only honest communication can build trust. And once you understand that an avoidant can struggle to put emotions into words, we can go one level deeper. Because sometimes the problem isn't simply that they don't know how to communicate what they feel. Sometimes closeness itself activates something inside them that makes them want to regain control. This is where the push-pull dynamic becomes so confusing. At first, everything may feel natural. They're interested, they're engaged, they're curious about you. They may open up more than you expected. You begin to feel that something real is developing. Then the relationship starts becoming emotionally significant, and suddenly their behavior changes. The messages slow down. The emotional availability decreases. They become harder to reach. They may tell you they need space, become unusually independent, or act as though the connection has suddenly become too demanding. You think, what did I do? But sometimes the most important thing that happened was simply this. The relationship started to matter. That's the paradox. For someone who associates emotional closeness with vulnerability, dependence, loss of autonomy, or potential rejection, intimacy can create psychological pressure. The closer they feel to another person, the more exposed they may feel. And when exposure rises, the nervous system may interpret that vulnerability as something that needs to be escaped. Now, I'm not saying every avoidant consciously thinks, I'm getting too close, therefore I must run. Human psychology is rarely that deliberate. Much of this happens automatically. A person may simply experience an uncomfortable sensation they can't explain. They feel crowded even when nobody is actually crowding them. They feel a need to be alone even though they were enjoying the relationship yesterday. They suddenly become hyper-aware of imperfections. They start questioning compatibility. They convince themselves they need freedom. Distance provides immediate relief. And that's an important psychological principle. We tend to repeat behaviors that temporarily reduce discomfort. If withdrawing makes emotional pressure disappear, withdrawal can become reinforced. But here's the problem. The relief is temporary. Once enough distance exists, the emotional need for connection can return. They begin missing the person. They remember the good moments. They become curious about what you're doing. They wonder whether you've moved on. So they come closer again. And the cycle begins. Closeness, discomfort, distance, relief, longing, return, closeness again. That is the push-pull cycle. And if you are on the receiving end, it can become emotionally addictive because inconsistency creates uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps your attention locked onto the relationship. When they're distant, you want them closer. When they return, you feel relief. Then, when they withdraw again, you become anxious and start searching for answers. This is why mixed signals can become more psychologically consuming than a clear rejection. A clear no gives the mind an ending. Ambiguity gives the mind a puzzle. And human beings will spend extraordinary amounts of energy solving puzzles that have emotional significance. But here is where you need to reclaim your power. You don't have to participate in the cycle simply because you understand it. Understanding someone else's psychology should give you clarity, not make you tolerate chaos. If their instinct is to create distance when intimacy becomes uncomfortable, you can recognize that without chasing them through every withdrawal. You don't have to prove that you're safe. You don't have to convince them that love won't hurt them. You don't have to become smaller, quieter, less demanding, or endlessly available so they won't feel threatened. Because healthy intimacy requires two people who can tolerate closeness without repeatedly destroying the connection to escape the discomfort that closeness creates. And this is where personal responsibility enters the conversation. An avoidant may have legitimate fears. Those fears may have deep psychological roots. But adulthood requires us to eventually confront the patterns that hurt other people. Fear explains behavior. It doesn't permanently excuse behavior. And your responsibility is equally clear. You must stop confusing someone's internal conflict with your responsibility to rescue them from it. Let them confront their fear. Let them decide whether they're willing to grow. Your job is to remain grounded in what you require from a healthy relationship. Because love should not require you to constantly negotiate with someone's fear of intimacy. It should challenge you, yes, it should expose you, absolutely. But it should also give you enough consistency to feel that you're building something rather than constantly recovering from it. So, when an avoidant pulls away after becoming close, don't immediately ask, how do I get them back? Ask a more powerful question. What does their pattern tell me about what they are currently capable of giving? That question moves you from obsession to awareness, and awareness gives you choice. You cannot control someone's fear of intimacy, but you can control whether their fear becomes your life. And once you understand why closeness can trigger the need to regain control, there is another layer that we have to confront, because this is where the mixed signals can become especially painful. Sometimes distance isn't simply about wanting freedom. Sometimes distance is protection. Think about what vulnerability actually requires. When you tell someone what you feel, you're giving them information they can use to hurt you, reject you, disappoint you, or leave you. You're saying, this person matters to me. And the moment you admit that, you have something to lose. For someone who has learned to survive emotionally by minimizing dependence on others, that realization can feel threatening. So what do? They create emotional insurance. They keep one foot inside the relationship and one foot outside it. They show enough interest to maintain connection, but enough distance to preserve a sense of safety. They may want you, but avoid needing you. They may miss you, but refuse to admit it. They may care about your opinion, but act as though they don't. They may feel jealous, but never openly acknowledge why. And from your perspective, it looks contradictory. But psychologically, the contradiction can make sense. They're attempting to solve two problems at once. How do I stay connected without becoming vulnerable? That's an impossible equation, because genuine intimacy requires some vulnerability. You cannot build deep trust while remaining completely protected from emotional risk. And this is one of the great philosophical truths about relationships. The things that make love meaningful are the same things that make love frightening. To care is to become vulnerable. To trust is to surrender some control. To attach is to accept that another human being has the power to affect you. You cannot eliminate that risk without eliminating some of the intimacy as well. And an avoidant pattern may attempt to eliminate the risk. If they don't say what they feel, they can't be rejected for saying it. If they don't ask for reassurance, they can't be denied. If they don't fully commit, they can't experience the same sense of loss when something ends. If they maintain emotional distance, they can tell themselves they are independent. The problem is that emotional protection comes with a price. The walls that keep pain out also keep intimacy out. And eventually the very strategy that was designed to protect them from abandonment can create the emotional distance they fear. This is why you must be careful with the temptation to interpret every protective behavior as proof of hidden love. Maybe there is love there. Maybe there is fear. Maybe there is attachment. But you cannot build a healthy relationship on speculation. You need observable reality. What are they actually doing? Are they becoming more honest? Are they taking responsibility? Are they communicating when they need space rather than disappearing? Are they learning to tolerate emotional closeness? Are they willing to repair the damage caused by withdrawal? Those questions are far more valuable than endlessly asking, do they secretly care? Because someone can care about you and still be unable to give you a healthy relationship. That's a painful truth, but it's also a liberating one. You don't need to demonize them. You don't need to diagnose them. You don't need to turn them into a villain just because their coping strategy hurts you. But you also don't need to become their therapist, rescuer, or emotional translator. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect, and boundaries without compassion can become punishment. The goal is neither. The goal is mature discernment. You can say, I understand that vulnerability may be difficult for you. I understand that your instinct may be to withdraw when things become emotionally intense, but I also understand that I deserve communication, respect, and consistency. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson for both people in the relationship. The avoidant has to learn that vulnerability is not the same thing as weakness. And the person loving the avoidant has to learn that understanding someone does not require abandoning themselves. Because you cannot love someone into emotional maturity. You can offer safety. You can offer honesty. You can offer patience. But eventually they must choose the courage to step beyond the walls they've built. And you must choose the courage to stop standing outside those walls, begging to be let in. You can understand someone's defenses without making their defenses your destiny. And this brings us to one of the most important parts of the entire conversation. Because once you understand why an avoidant may withdraw, protect themselves, or struggle with vulnerability, you have to look at what happens on the other side of that behavior. What happens to you when someone becomes inconsistent? You react, and that's human. They pull away, and you feel the urge to reach out. They become distant, and you want an explanation. They stop communicating, and suddenly you want to communicate more. They return, and you feel relief. Then they disappear again, and you're back to wondering what went wrong. This is how the cycle can become self-reinforcing. The avoidant feels emotional pressure and creates distance. You experience that distance as a threat to the relationship, so you move closer. Your pursuit increases their perception of pressure. They withdraw further. Their withdrawal increases your anxiety. Your anxiety increases your pursuit. And now both people are responding to each other's nervous systems rather than consciously choosing their behavior. That's the deeper dynamic. Neither person necessarily wakes up and says, today I'm going to create an unhealthy relationship pattern. It emerges gradually. One person protects themselves by moving away. The other protects themselves by moving closer. And the more each person does what feels natural to them, the more intensely the other person's fear is activated. This is why mixed signals can become so psychologically powerful. You're not simply responding to what the person did, you're responding to uncertainty. And uncertainty has a unique ability to capture attention. When something is predictable, the brain doesn't need to constantly monitor it. But when something is unpredictable, your attention stays activated. You begin checking, thinking, analyzing, replaying, waiting. What did that message mean? Why were they warm yesterday and cold today? Why did they come back? Why did they disappear? Should I reach out? Should I give them space? And eventually the relationship begins occupying far more mental space than it deserves. You are no longer simply experiencing the relationship, you're managing the relationship. And that's exhausting. But here's the point I want you to hear clearly. Your reaction can unintentionally reinforce the very pattern that is hurting you. If every withdrawal produces immediate pursuit, the avoidant may learn that distance brings them control and closeness brings pressure. If every return is rewarded with unlimited access to you without any conversation about what happened, there is no incentive for the pattern to change. This doesn't mean you should manipulate them by withholding affection. It doesn't mean you should play games. It doesn't mean you should suddenly become cold to make them chase. That's still allowing their behavior to control you. Real power is different. Real power is emotional self-regulation. It is the ability to say, I notice that you're pulling away. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to chase. I'm also not going to retaliate. I'm going to remain grounded and allow your behavior to give me information. That is maturity, because boundaries are not punishments. A boundary is simply a decision about what you will participate in. You can care about someone and still say, I cannot continue a relationship defined by uncertainty. You can understand their fears and still require communication. You can leave the door open for healthy connection without standing at the door all day waiting for someone to decide whether they want to enter. And this is where your self-respect becomes more powerful than your desire for reassurance. You don't need to prove that you're lovable by tolerating inconsistency. You don't need to chase someone into recognizing your value. You don't need to perform emotional labor for two people. Because the moment you stop making their withdrawal an emergency, you change the entire psychological equation. Now they have the space to make their own choice. They can move towards you because they genuinely want connection, or they can remain distant. Either way, you receive something priceless, clarity, and clarity is often more valuable than temporary closeness, because your goal should never be to get someone to stay at any cost. Your goal should be to build a relationship where both people freely choose to stay. So the next time someone sends mixed signals, pause before you react. Ask yourself, am I responding from love or am I responding from fear of losing them? That question can change everything, because when you stop chasing certainty from someone who is committed to uncertainty, you finally create certainty within yourself. Stop chasing their clarity. Become clear about yourself. And now we arrive at the point where all of this becomes personal. Not because you need to figure out the avoidant, but because you need to decide what you are going to do with what you now understand. Because here's the danger. You can become so fascinated by someone's psychology that you forget to live your own life. You can spend weeks asking, why did they pull away? Why did they come back? Why do they look at my story but not message me? Why do they seem jealous but refuse to commit? Why do they act like they care and then disappear? And eventually you're not living from your own values anymore. You're living in reaction to their behavior. That's not clarity. That's emotional captivity. And the way out is not to become better at interpreting mixed signals. The way out is to become deeply clear about what you require, because there's a fundamental difference between understanding someone and building a life around their limitations. You can understand that they fear vulnerability. You can understand that intimacy activates their defenses. You can understand that their childhood experiences, past relationships, or learned coping mechanisms may influence how they connect. You can have compassion for all of it, but none of that changes the central question. Can they participate in a relationship that meets your basic emotional needs? That's the question. Not, do they secretly love me? Not, are they thinking about me? Not, will they eventually come back? Those questions keep your attention focused on their internal world. The stronger question is, what are they consistently showing me? Because feelings without action are potential, and relationships are built through behavior. Someone may care deeply and still communicate poorly. Someone may miss you and still remain unavailable. Someone may fear losing you and still refuse to create security with you. Someone may have powerful emotions and still lack the emotional maturity necessary to turn those emotions into a healthy partnership. And you have to be willing to accept that distinction. This is where clarity becomes an act of self-respect. Clarity doesn't mean demanding that someone give you immediate answers. It means refusing to live indefinitely without answers. It doesn't mean forcing commitment. It means knowing that you don't have to remain indefinitely in a situation that repeatedly destabilizes you. It doesn't mean punishing someone for needing space. It means deciding what healthy space looks like for you. There is a profound philosophical principle here. You cannot control another person's choices, but you can choose the conditions under which you participate. That's freedom. And freedom in relationships doesn't mean you don't care. It means your identity doesn't collapse when someone else becomes uncertain. You can say, I care about you, but I also care about myself. I understand that you need space, but I need communication. I respect your fear, but I won't build my future around it. That is what emotional strength sounds like. And ironically, this is often where relationships become clearer. When you stop chasing, manipulating, persuading, and over-explaining, you remove the noise. Now the other person has to confront their own choice. They can move towards you with greater honesty. They can communicate what they need. They can take responsibility for their patterns. Or they can remain distant. But either way, you are no longer trapped in the role of emotional detective. You're observing reality. And reality, unlike mixed signals, eventually tells the truth. So don't make your mission, how do I make this avoidant understand how valuable I am? Your mission is to understand your own value so deeply that you no longer need inconsistent behavior to confirm it. That's the transformation. You stop asking, what do I need to do so they won't leave? And you start asking, what kind of relationship allows me to remain fully myself? That's a completely different question. One comes from fear, the other comes from self-respect. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson in all of this. You don't need to become ruthless. You don't need to become emotionally unavailable yourself. You don't need to play games. You simply need standards. You need the courage to let actions speak louder than potential. You need the wisdom to recognize that understanding someone's wounds doesn't obligate you to live inside them. And you need enough love for yourself to choose peace when confusion becomes the dominant language of the relationship. Because the goal isn't to win against the avoidant. The goal is to stop losing yourself. And once you do that, everything changes. You don't find freedom by finally decoding them. You find freedom by finally choosing yourself. So when you step back and look at the entire picture, you begin to understand that mixed signals are rarely as simple as they appear. Sometimes an avoidant feels deeply but struggles to communicate those feelings. Sometimes closeness activates fear. Sometimes distance becomes a form of emotional protection. And sometimes the more important question isn't what they feel, but what they are actually capable of giving. Because you cannot build a secure relationship by living inside someone else's contradictions. You can understand their psychology without becoming consumed by it. You can have compassion for their fear without making excuses for behavior that continually hurts you. You can recognize that they may care without convincing yourself that caring is enough. And that's where your power begins. Stop measuring your worth by how quickly someone responds. Stop interpreting every silence. Stop turning every withdrawal into a personal rejection. Stop believing that if you just love harder, explain better, wait longer, or become more patient, you can somehow eliminate another person's fear. You can't. Their emotional development is their responsibility. Your emotional stability is yours. And perhaps the greatest mistake people make in relationships is confusing potential with reality. You may see who someone could become. You may see the love underneath their defenses. You may understand the reasons behind their behavior. But you still have to live with what they are choosing today. So ask yourself, what does their behavior consistently show me? Does this relationship give me peace, honesty, respect, and emotional safety? Or am I constantly trying to earn clarity from someone who keeps giving me confusion? Those questions matter, because love should not require you to abandon yourself. Real strength isn't becoming cold. It isn't pretending you don't care. It isn't manipulating someone into chasing you. Real strength is being able to care deeply while remaining anchored in yourself. You can leave space for someone to grow without putting your life on hold while they do it. You can keep your heart open without leaving your boundaries unprotected. And you can walk away from confusion without hating the person who created it. That's emotional maturity. So if someone sends you mixed signals, don't immediately ask, how do I get them to choose me? Ask, am I choosing myself? Because that is the question that changes everything. Maybe they will eventually confront their fears. Maybe they will learn to communicate. Maybe they will become capable of giving the kind of love they once struggled to express. But whether they do or they don't, your life cannot be built around waiting for that transformation. Your future deserves clarity. Your heart deserves consistency. And your peace deserves protection. Remember this, you are not responsible for decoding someone else's emotions. You are responsible for honoring your own. And when you become clear about what you deserve, mixed signals lose their power. You stop chasing. You stop guessing. You stop proving. You stop waiting for someone else to tell you that you are valuable. You already know. So walk forward with compassion, but walk forward with standards. Love people without losing yourself. Understand their wounds without living inside them. And never confuse someone's inability to express love with a requirement for you to accept less than healthy love. Because at the end of the day, the greatest victory isn't making an avoidant finally say what they feel. The greatest victory is becoming so clear about your worth that you no longer need anyone's mixed signals to define it.